One of my favourite questions is when people on courses ask, so what do you do in solution focus when the client's best hopes are for someone else to change? And the way that people ask it, it sounds as if they are assuming that that is problematic. But actually, wanting someone else to change seems to me to be an entirely normal thing. Why wouldn't people want their child, for example, to behave differently? Why wouldn't people want their partner to behave differently? Why wouldn't people want their boss or their social worker or whoever it is, their teacher perhaps, to behave differently? So, given that it is normal, and given that it's something that many people say, it's important to have ways of working with this in our mind. And I think there's three ways of working with this. The first is, obviously, to go with what the client wants. So the client says, I want my partner to be different. And we can say, okay, so if your partner were to be behaving differently, what difference might that make in your relationship or in family life? Whichever seems more appropriate. And very often the person says, well, we'd be getting on better. Things would be better. There'd be fewer arguments. And we say, okay, so you'd be getting on better. There'd be fewer arguments. What would take the place of the arguments? Well, we'd be having fun again, like we used to all those years ago when we first met. And on we go, and if you are having fun again in the way that we used to when we first met, what might you find yourselves doing now that perhaps, you're not doing so much, all right? And on we go, describing that life. And then, of course, we can begin to ask, so tell us about the times when even tiny little bits of that are happening. How do you manage to do that? And what would it look like if just that getting on better, whatever they said, were growing just a tiny bit? So what we have, using the very simple and very useful question, what difference would that make? We have a very straightforward solution-focused conversation. And then there's some people who, in the talking, seem to stay closer, for whatever reason, to the idea of the partner changing. Let's take that example. Now, if people do, again, there's a very simple and straightforward way of working with that. The first job is to invite them to describe what changes might they notice in the partner that they would be happy to see. And what else, and what else, and what else. And on we go, inviting them to describe in more and more detail the version of the partner that they would like to be living with. And once they've described that in huge detail, we can then very simply say, and I guess that if your partner were doing all of those things, it would make a big difference to you. You'd be pleased. And people, of course, say yes. And so then we can ask, so if he or she were to be doing all of those things, how might you be responding differently? And we invite the person we're sitting with, the client we're sitting with, into, again, a really, really detailed picture of that different response to the partner being different. And when we've actually elicited some detail, we can ask the question, and would your partner be happy to see you being that way? And typically people say yes. So then we can go on. So how might your partner respond to you responding differently to him or her being different? And back and forth we go, inviting and amplifying the difference. At the end of all of that, of course, we can begin to ask, well, on a scale, where would you see yourselves now, the two of you, in relation to that future that you want for yourself? So away we go, again, somewhat similar. Now, there's just a third little approach that is useful when people say they want someone else to change, but actually it's unlikely to happen. You know, I'd like him or her to be different, but it won't happen because he or she's always been that way. You know, teachers are inherently, according to the child, unfair, so how can we expect a teacher suddenly to start behaving fairly? Now, when people say that, there are two tracks that we can take. One is to leapfrog the impossibility and just say, okay, I can understand your skepticism, your doubts that he will ever change. And if he were to, what might you notice? And how might you notice yourself responding differently? Or we can say, okay, so it sounds that it's impossible for him to change. So let's just imagine for a moment that you begin to notice life going a tiny bit better for you, even though he hasn't changed. What might you notice about yourself that would tell you that life was going a tiny bit better, even though he, she, they, whoever, hadn't made those changes that you would really, really, really want them to make? Or, of course, if again people are saying, but it's impossible, they'll never change, and I can't change unless they change, then we can ask, well, given that the change that you really, really want, you're saying is absolutely impossible, that neither they can change, and if they don't change, you can't change, what's the best that you could hope for from coming to this meeting? How could you know that actually this meeting had turned out to be useful to you, even though he, she, or they actually haven't changed, and you can't make the changes that you would want to make if they don't change? And at that point, we sometimes hear people talking about, I'd be managing it better, I'd be coping better. So there we are. A number of ways of responding to the question that people very often ask, so, what do you do when the client's best hopes are for someone else to change?